Welcome to the enchanting world of Bella Brown's historical Western romance. I'm delighted to share this journey with you today. Before we ride into the story, if you enjoy these narrations, please consider subscribing to this channel. It's a small gesture that makes a big difference, and your support makes it possible to continue bringing these heartfelt tales to listeners everywhere, completely free of charge. Now find yourself a comfortable spot, close your eyes if you wish, and allow your imagination to travel back to the American frontier, where adventure and romance await. This audiobook presentation features The Bride Who Escaped Christmas by Bella Brown. All rights reserved. Chapter 1. As soon as Ebba Frampton popped open the bedroom window, the icy December air blasted her unceremoniously, sending goosebumps racing across her skin. She leaned out of the window and had to narrow her eyes against the flurries of snowflakes slapping at her face. She peered down to assess how she'd make her descent, but the ground was obscured by the snowstorm that raged. Her mother's stark words of warning drifted through her mind. One of these days, Ebba, your impetuous nature, will get you into trouble. You mark my words. Ebba reached back into the room and grabbed the cloth bag she'd fashioned from the expensive linen covering her bed. Asking Bruce for him to return her valise case was out of the question, especially after his abhorrent behavior earlier that evening. Her wedding dress was hanging in pride of place above the bed, a stark reminder of why she needed to get a move on, rather than debating how she wished she'd listened to her mother for once. There would be time enough for her mother to gloat that Ebba should have never boarded that train. All she could concentrate on right now was getting back to Boston. Ebba wished she'd never even heard of Bruce Frey, let alone accepted a marriage proposal from the brute. Ebba threw the bag out of the window and nimbly hooked a leg over the ledge, dropping next to her bag on the veranda that spanned the grand house. Her heart pounded in her ears, her ragged breathing obliterating any other noises that she ought to be listening out for. She duck-walked along the veranda roof until she reached the edge. She'd prayed for more snowfall to disguise the direction of her footsteps, for she knew that Bruce Frey would not take kindly to his fiancée absconding in the middle of the night, mere hours before she was supposed to marry him. She'd taken the storm as a sign and had packed up what little belongings she'd had in the room he'd locked her in. The wind lashed the house, rattling windows, so that she didn't have to be worried that someone might hear her ripping at the bed linen. Somewhere a lone dog barked, and for an instant she froze. She hadn't even thought about dogs alerting one of the miners that lived next to Bruce Frey's impressive home that something was amiss. But in the buffeting storm, she wasn't even sure how far the sound would carry. They all worked in his mind. They'd have no compunction with handing her back to Bruce. There was no telling what he'd do to her if he caught her trying to escape. No one ventured out of their warm cabins. She doubted anyone would expect to see a woman out alone on a night such as this. She sent her bag over the veranda's edge and quickly shimmied down the spiky vines that covered the side of the house. The heavy snowfall that night meant that she had a soft landing when she leaped off the vines. She sucked at her palm where something had pierced the soft skin. She didn't even wait to see if anyone noticed her. She scooped up her bag and sprinted for the trees, just as one of the yard dogs set up a racket. Its neighbor sent out another alert. She reached the tree line as a voice bellowed at the dogs to quit it. The sound jettisoned a knife of cold fear through her body. She didn't stop. She didn't want to look back at the home that had been designed to tell the world just how impressed they should be with Bruce Frey. She didn't want that home, or that life. And definitely not that man. It was probably just the watchman who sat in a tiny hut at the entrance of the yard. Ebba plunged into the trees, confident in the knowledge that the man was probably in a drunken stupor on such a cold night. Her breath left her body in pants, the frozen air sawing at her throat and biting at her fingers and cheeks. She tried to dip under the greenery carefully, but the snow that dropped onto her turned her dress into a freezing coat. She didn't care. She had to keep moving. Branches clawed at her hair and face, scratching painfully as she pressed through the thick foliage. twigs snapped underfoot. A few times, she stumbled when her foot sank into the thick snow, but she pushed on. She had a rough idea of the terrain in her head in the few days that she'd been here. She'd arrived by stagecoach. Bruce had sent one of his lackeys to collect her from the swing station at Rusty Ridge, though Ebba had a mind to walk through the night and head for Marrowcliff, which had the home station. There, it should be busy enough that she could meld into the crowd, catch a stage to Wolfburg, and meet the train there so that she could make her way back to Boston. She wished she'd have had the forethought to pick up a weapon, but there hadn't been much thought put into this escape plan. She'd much rather take her chances with the wild animals that lurked in the darkness instead. Nothing that lived amongst the spruce and fir trees that bordered Frey's mine was as dangerous as the man who owned the place. The trees thinned out, and Ebba found herself in an opening. She stood in the center to gain her bearings, shivering as her breath made panting puffs of air. She turned slowly, trying to make out the shapes and shadows in the pale, eerie light. She should have reached the road by now. It was the fastest way back to Marrowcliff. She wondered if she'd got turned around in the dark. She didn't have time to dawdle and be indecisive. She had to keep moving, or else. She swiped at the frustrated tears that streaked down her face, wincing as her hand caught the side of her face that was bruised and swollen. Her eye was the only reason Bruce hadn't married her already. It wouldn't look right in front of the mayor if an important man such as Bruce Frey was marrying a woman with a blackened eye. She kept on walking, sniffing loudly as she did. Thought clouded her mind. She needed to think, to formulate a different plan, but she was so cold. Keep going. He's coming for you. She put one foot in front of the other, clutching the sodden cloth bag to her chest. In the end, she gave up trying to duck under the trees, just pushed through them. Arms stinging, limbs sluggish, she wanted to lie down and rest, just for a moment. From a distance, she heard the barking. The sounds melded with her pounding blood and the breath sawing in and out of her lungs. Her mother was right. She'd brought all of this on her head. Ebba had always craved adventure. She hadn't wanted the indulged life of a socialite. The dream of falling in love with a stranger and moving to a rugged land like Montana had captured her wild imagination and her adventurous heart. Her friends had shivered in revulsion, and Ebba had lapped up their shock. Her mother had begged and lamented over where she had gone wrong, raising such a controversial daughter. Her father blamed her mother for all of Ebba's outrageous antics. If she hadn't given her such an exotic name, she wouldn't have to live up to its nature. He'd wanted to name her Jane. No one called Jane would ever dream of running off. She had put herself into this mess. She needed to give up, to lie down, to wait for Bruce to finish the job. If she was dead, she would at least have escaped the life of being married to such an awful man. The barking grew louder. Ebba stumbled into the snow, losing her balance. She was tired, so tired. Why did she need to move? She couldn't recall where she was. Was it all a bad dream? She wasn't even cold anymore. Warmth filled her, and she lay back in the snow. Snowflakes dusted her eyes, and she sighed. If only that barking would stop, she could finally go to sleep. Chapter 2. Hal Wyman awoke the instant Kite alerted. When the growls continued to boil in the dog's throat, Hal rolled off his cot and picked up his gun in one smooth movement. The snowstorm that had lulled him to sleep had abated a little, though still whistled through the rafters of the cabin's roof. Hal pulled aside the cloth he'd hammered into the wall above the window. Clouds had thinned enough to allow moonlight to illuminate the clearing. His eyes tracked the perimeter, lingering on the outhouse where the horse was. Wolves hunted in packs, and there were traps all around his property. He'd hung up sacks packed with herbs and his scent to discourage them from roaming too close. But a hungry lone wolf wouldn't care. No prints in the snow, nothing that looked out of place even as it was buffeted by the winds. Hal looked at the dog who stood at the door to the cabin. Kite still growled. "There's nothing out there, you fool dog." Kite didn't move, but yipped at him instead. The high-pitched noise knitted Hal's brows. That was his people bark. Hal looked again, but saw nothing. Kite began to bark louder, more insistently at the door. Hal rolled his eyes and dragged on his furs. If this turns out to be you just needing to find a tree to cock your leg against, I swear it'll be your coat that I'm wearing next. It's the middle of the night. Kite bounced on his forelegs at the door, yapping excitedly, and then forced his nose through the gap Hal made when he opened the door. The dog took off towards the stable. Hal squinted to see what it was that had his dog all worked up as he charged through the swirling snowfall. He was wagging his tail, nosing at a dark mound in the snow that hadn't been there moments before. Hal's blood thrummed with awareness. He swung his gun up ready, the snow crunching under his boots, his eyes unwavering on the dark heap that looked suspiciously human-like. "What the?" He pulled up short. A woman, her upturned face almost as pale as the snow she lay in. Hal looked around him, wondering if it was a trap of some kind. He lived this way, tucked away in the middle of the forest so that he wouldn't have to deal with people. There weren't many people who knew he was here. The only interaction he ever had was with the ones he sold the skins and animals that he caught and traded to live. That suited him just fine. A woman, alone in the forest. She was bruised, battered, and scratched up. Just how was he supposed to explain a dead body that had turned up on his lands to the local sheriff? Kite licked at her face, and Hal blinked with surprise. Not dead. Her eyes fluttered. Hal sighed dejectedly. He deliberately avoided people and had for years. Yet he couldn't leave her out here. She might be alive now, but she wouldn't be for much longer unless she warmed up. I'd better not regret this. With a growl, he placed the rifle into the leather holster on his back, nudged Kite out of the way, and slid his arms under her. She was as cold as the ice that bit into his hands. "You're not even dressed for this weather," he muttered, and lifted her up into his arms, firmly closing off the part of his mind that wanted to remind him how long it was since he'd touched another person. "No coat, no gloves. Idiot! Kite, fetch that bag!" He indicated the item with a nod of his head. The dog happily trotted in front of them both, the ball of cloth dangling from his mouth. Hal kicked the door closed behind them and set her down on his cot. With a quick assessment, he could tell that she wasn't injured elsewhere. The twigs wound through her sodden hair and sticking out of her ripped clothing told him that she'd been wandering around in the woods. She must have stumbled on the place by accident, which settled his nerves a little. Chances were that someone would be looking for her, though. She looked as out of place in his bed as a fish on a riverbank. He covered her with several blankets and set about stoking the fire up once more. He worked methodically, dividing his attention between the lifeless woman in his bed and the flames licking around the logs. What would have possessed her to be wandering about in the wilderness? She couldn't have been out in that storm for long. She wouldn't have survived wearing that expensive-looking dress, or at least what was left of it. She was banged up a bit. Scratches were visible on her pale skin through where her dress had been shredded. The fire warmed the cabin up quickly, and he laid the furs warmed from his body heat on top of her blanket. In repose, she was beautiful. Her smooth alabaster skin was starting to pink up from the heat of the fire. She had a narrow nose and a long neck, but his eyes kept studying the bruise that covered the left side of her face. It was yellowing at the edges. He'd been in enough fights over the years to know that that black eye was a few days old. Hal sat with his back against the wall, and Kite took full advantage of being able to lie alongside him. He ruffled the dog's back, tumultuous thoughts bubbling. Just what was she doing here? His eyes slid to the ball of cloth that she'd had with her. He was a private man, but he needed to know whom he was dealing with. He pressed to his feet, checking her slumbering form once more before he began to tug at the knotted edges of cloth that had been used to form a makeshift bag. Clothes, expensive and vibrant, a purse with a few coins, a small silver hand mirror with an ornately engraved back, a hairbrush with what appeared to be mother-of-pearl and tortoiseshell handle, a gold locket that held a lock of hair and a portrait of a woman. All of them were valuable. So what were they doing bundled into what looked like a piece of torn bedding? She didn't look like much of a thief. Maybe she was a maid and had been caught stealing. Hal sighed, and he draped the exquisite dresses around his shabby cabin to dry. the juxtaposition of wealth against his humble home more evident. He resumed his position against the wall. Her ragged breathing began to even out, and the sound of another person in his space kicked at his memory bank. Days long ago, when he'd watched Lucy sleep with their son nursing at her breast, thinking of them knifed through his heart. He quickly stood and began to pace, breathing deeply so that he remained calm. It was only when the woman began to moan, and violent shivers made the bed tremble, that the orb of tightness in his chest began to loosen. Pain with hypothermia was a good thing. Her body was coming back to life. He needed her to wake up and leave. He should have put her in the outhouse. That would have been preferable to her breaching the walls of the haven he'd buried himself in. His pacing stumbled when Lucy's voice rang through his mind, scalding him for even thinking of treating the woman like he would a horse. "Halbert Wyman, you will do no such thing. The good Lord sent her here for a reason. She wouldn't be out here wearing next to nothing unless she had no choice. You need to make some broth. Use those chicken bones. She needs to warm up on the inside." Hal dragged his hands along his face, the rough textured scar that ran down his face and along his neck, a stark reminder of why he lived the way he did. Lucy was right, wasn't she always? He added water and root vegetables to the chicken bones, heating the mix in the blackened pot over his fire. Dawn eventually crept over the horizon, lighting up the room. Hal rolled back the cloth off the window, eyes assessing. Nothing looked disturbed. No one had been out looking for her, at least not recently. Only a few prints of what looked like deer and a rabbit were visible in the snow. The storm had swept the snow into drifts against the outhouses, the branches of the fir trees bowing under the weight of the fresh powder. He let Kite out, who padded around the clearing, cocking his leg and sniffing where they'd picked the woman up from the night before. The air was fresh and still, the sky a clear azure that made his eyes ache. She still hadn't moved when he returned, his arms full of firewood. He built up the fire, tended to the broth. He wanted to go and check his traps before the local wild animals used what had been caught as a free buffet. Yet he couldn't leave her. He walked over to her and dropped to his haunches to study her better in the daylight. Her hair was a fiery red that last night had appeared as dark as Lucy's had been because it had been so wet. Her cheeks were rosy from the heat, and her full lips had returned to a more natural color. Up close, he could see the smattering of freckles that dusted her skin. He saw the swelling at the corner of her mouth, a bruise that looked fresher than the one over her eye. He scratched at the whiskers on his throat. He'd become adept at reading people. Whether it was from years of living alone with only his dog for company, or if it was from his years of working with a range of eclectic people, he prided himself on being a good judge of character. She had expensive dresses and trinkets in her bag, yet she was unchaperoned. She didn't look as though she'd ever worked a day in her life. Her small hands had long, elegant fingers without the telltale calluses. He couldn't assume that a man had been the one to put his hands on her and mark her like that. She may have fallen over, though the bruise visible on her shoulder through a tear in her dress was also a day or so old, so she couldn't have sustained it last night in the woods. He leaned closer to peer at the scratches, red and angry looking. The skin felt hot to the touch. It would need a poultice and a clean. His heart stuttered when her eyes shot open. Eyes that were the color of meadow grass in the height of summer were staring back at him. Confusion clouded them as she blinked. Once, twice. Then panic swept the fog aside and her terrified screams rent the air. Chapter 3. She'd been drifting, content on listening to the maid move around her bedroom, though she couldn't recall getting into bed last night. The fire crackled in the hearth, and there was the scent of food drifting into her bedchamber. She would wear her new gray dress today. What day was it? She tried to pull at her thoughts, but lethargy weighed her eyelids down. She felt a gentle probing at her shoulder. Stinging lanced through the cloud that enveloped her, piercing it so that sentience blasted through her. She opened her eyes and looked at the unfamiliar roof. She tried to pull on her memory of how she'd come to be here. She moved her eyes and saw the scarred face of the dark-haired man. For just a moment, she wasn't sure if she was still dreaming. Pain only rocketed. Her face throbbed. It felt as though her whole body burned. Lethargy vanished as the memories crashed over her. She remembered running, terrified, scared through the forest. The man blinked. Not a dream. He was very much real. Terror seized her. The scream ripped from her throat as she recalled what it was that she had been running from. The man stumbled backward, turning his face away so that she could no longer see the damaged side. He held out a hand, waving it in her direction. "Miss, please," he side-eyed her. "I won't hurt you." "You're safe." Eyes wild, she wanted to flee, but inert muscles screamed at her so that when she stood, the floor tilted violently, and she stumbled. He appeared at her side, his tone gentle, and he assisted her back down. "Easy, now." "Where am I?" she croaked, pulling her arm away from him after she'd eased herself back against the warmth of the bed that she'd been in. She felt as weak as a kitten. "Eagle's Pass," he said quietly. She begged her body to stop trembling. She didn't know the territory well enough to recognize the name. "How far am I from Rusty Ridge?" His brow quirked and something moved behind his eyes as he studied her. "About 6 miles as the crow flies." Her lip disappeared between her teeth. 6 miles wasn't nearly far enough away. "Are you heading that way or leaving there?" the man asked. "Could I trouble you for some water?" Ebba hedged. "I'm parched." The man moved stealthily about the confines of the cabin. They were in a single room. A large dog sat near the only door that she could see in the building. Rustic wooden furniture told her he lived a simple existence. 1 chair, a tiny table. She sat on the only cot. No family, no adornments. Her eyes came to a stop as she spotted her clothing draped across a wooden frame in front of the open fire. "Is that my dress?" "Yes, they were soaked through. That dress you have on is ruined," he indicated with the metal cup he passed to her. She took the cup and looked down. He was right. Her sleeves were in tatters, the fine fabric too shredded even for the most skilled dressmaker to rescue. She sipped, unable to stop the happy sigh when the icy water hit her scorched throat. "Thank you," she murmured. "What's your name?" he asked, his face still turned away from her. Ebba took another sip. She knew Bruce Frey well enough to know that she didn't want to marry the brute, but she also wasn't acquainted with any of his friends or peers. This man could be on his payroll. "Jane," she replied quickly, her eyes not meeting his. She didn't elaborate on any more details. Her tension dipped slightly when he gave her a single nod. She cleared her throat, knowing that it would seem strange if she didn't ask him, "What's your name?" "Hal Wyman." His voice was gruff. "That's Kite in the corner." "Your dog is called Kite?" Ebba's voice was laced with amusement at the toy name for his pet. Hal's shoulder lifted, though his expression remained stern. "It's just a name." He tended to the fire, which allowed Ebba to study the room. Animal skins hung on the back of the door, with various tools stacked alongside the door jamb, but it was the rifle in pride of place that gave her pause. "What were you doing out there?" She stilled at the loaded question that was uttered softly. She could pretend that she hadn't heard him, but that would seem just as peculiar. Visions of Bruce Frey looming over her danced through her mind's eye. Her fingertip rimmed the top of the cup. "I got lost," she said. It was the truth, inasmuch as she'd not made it to Marrowcliff. Hal sat back on his haunches and considered her. She could see that he was puzzled over why she'd not really answered his question, as innocent as it was. The insightful stare wasn't as unnerving as her fiancé's had been, and her chin came up an inch, her eyes daring him to challenge her. "You got lost running to or from?" He'd not bought her act at all, and the panic was back. "I don't follow you." His lips split for a grin, though his attention returned to the flames in the hearth once more. He jabbed a metal poker into the hot ashes. "A lone woman running about out there, in the middle of a snowstorm. I'm not the cleverest of men, but even I know that ain't right. You're either running to somewhere or away from something. Can't say as I mind which, though I'd prefer it if the law wasn't going to come knocking on my door." She brushed at her skirts for something to do with her hands, anxiety rippling through her. Would Bruce Frey have called in the sheriff? There was no way a man like him would accept his fiancée running out on him like that. She needed to get away from here. She was still too close for comfort to the Frey property. She craned her neck to look through the window, relieved to see that the storm has passed. She must continue her journey. The sense of urgency that had made her climb through a window was like a fire under her. She tried to stand again, all too aware of how the man watched her carefully. She had to forcefully lock her knees and stand on legs that felt boneless. The simple action made beads of cold sweat pop out across her body. "What do you think you're doing?" She wanted to put the cup she held onto the ground, but didn't trust herself enough to bend down and make it back up. Instead, she held it out to him with a fixed smile. "I must be on my way. Thank you for your hospitality." The man straightened up. She had to lift her chin to meet his eyes, the dark brow on his good side climbing up high. "How far do you think you'll get when you can barely stand up in here where it's warm?" "The storm has passed. I'll be fine," she assured him shakily. "It hasn't passed. There'll be another along shortly." Ebba cast a dubious look at the bright blue skies through the window. "Looks okay to me." "Trust me," Hal retorted. "In a few hours we will have another whiteout. This is just the lull. Trust me." The words dragged an involuntary shiver across her skin. "Trust me. Ain't nobody coming here to save your sorry behind." She'd begged Bruce through the door he'd locked to keep her in the bedchambers. She rubbed her arms to ward off the chill. "I have to go," she whispered, her eyes moving to the vista beyond the windows. Surely, in the daylight, she'd be able to find her way again. "I need to get to Wolfburg." Hal digested her whispered words. "You want to meet the train?" She gave a brief nod, her eyes stinging with her burning tears. Home. She just wanted to go home. "The road is around 2 miles that way." He inclined his head in one direction. "Then it's about 30 miles to Wolfburg. Rusty Ridge has a swing station." She looked, continuing to study the tree line of fir trees, jutting through their snowy coats. She knew all of this, but smiled as if the information helped her. She'd taken the forest route to avoid the roads, knowing that Bruce Frey would have sent out a search party for her. A blink sent tears streaking down her cheeks. The grand gesture of escaping her bedroom last night had been futile. The only saving grace was that she was no longer under Frey's roof. The stagecoach goes through Rusty Ridge every 3 days or so. Marrowcliff has a home station, so does Tamebanks. They're around the same distance from here, neither of which are suitable for walking in this weather. Your best bet is Rusty Ridge, and wait for the stagecoach there. "I don't want to go to Rusty Ridge," she voiced, her fear rising. The swing station was too close to Bruce's place. "I need a train to." "Just a train. I'll just pack up my clothes and be on my way." Hal's breath hissed between gritted teeth. "Lady, I hauled you in here last night, but when my dog found you, I thought that you were dead. You were paler than the snow that covered you and bleeding about the place. Now you want to make a walk that'll take you more than 3 days, wearing next to nothing? Do you have a death wish?" Her legs gave way again and she dropped to the bed. She remembered that she'd heard the barking. You saved my life." "Don't know about that." His voice was rough, and he lifted his shoulder in a half shrug. "But I do know that you won't last long out there. You're like a newborn calf that's just hit the ground. You don't even have a coat in your fancy case." Her damp eyes went wide. "You went through my things?" This time, it was Hal who broke her startled stare. "I wasn't snooping. I thought you might need some dry clothing, and I—" Her flustered gaze darted about the cabin, relief blooming when she saw the small silk purse resting on the table. It contained everything that had been bequeathed to her by her grandmother. "If it's the law you're so worried about, it'll take them a day or so to get up to this place. I like my privacy, and there are traps all around. They keep out the undesirables. Usually." "I didn't steal those things," she told him fiercely when she realized that he thought her a thief. "Those are mine." She could see, by the way he looked at the purse and the tortoiseshell brush and then back at her, that he was having trouble believing her. And why would he? She hardly presented how a proper lady would behave. She was struck by an idea. "Do you have a horse here?" His good eye narrowed. "Yes, I have money. I could pay you. Would you take me to Marrowcliff?" "I don't go to Marrowcliff." "Please, Mr. Wyman, I need to." She checked herself before the whole sorry story came flooding out of her mouth. "You would be well compensated." Hal folded his arms. You only have a few coins in that purse. I thought you said that you didn't snoop? That half shrug again. I know what money feels like. I don't need to open it to know that you don't have that much in there. I have a set of pearls in there. They belong to my great-grandmother. They're very valuable. Take me to Marrowcliff and they're yours, he snorted derisively. What would I do with pearls? You can sell them, she cried. Cash, he told her, rubbing his fingertips together to demonstrate his point. I trade furs. I get paid in money. Fine, her hands went wide. She thought about the money that she had back in Boston, the only reason that Bruce Frey had declared his love for her. I can pay. Name your price. Hal rocked back on his heels, facing her fully for the first time as he considered her. $50. Done. Let's get going. She wavered on her feet as she stood once more. Do you have $50? She stilled, mentally shifting through what her purse contained. She knew that she had enough for her return train fare and a few meals. She considered what she could sell. Not on me, no, but I'm sure I could raise the funds by selling something when I got to Marrowcliff. She remembered the town being a bustling hub with stores and a bank. How do I know you won't take off on me? For all I know, the owner of all those trinkets is lying in an icy grave. Chapter 4. She was lying. Hal would lay his best rifle down on the gambling table on it. However, he was having difficulty with which part she was lying about. It was reasonable that she was acting shifty because she was afraid of him, or she could be that way because she was guilty of theft, or maybe worse. I assure you, all of that is mine. Hal sent her a look that let her know he didn't believe her. You can't even tell me your real name. It's Jane, she stated, though her voice shook. At least she looked as though she meant the fake name this time. Where are you from? Your accent is... You're not from around here. Her lips rolled inwards. I just need to get home for Christmas, she said. Irritation licked through him. She dodged every direct question he asked. Nothing about her added up. She looked groomed. She was eloquent, but people were strange. Desperate people did the darndest things to get themselves out of a scrape. He tried again. And where's home? Look, Mr. Wyman, she said after he'd watched her fidget for a few moments under his glare. You're clearly some type of businessman, she gestured about his cabin. This is a business deal. You provide a service, and you will be compensated adequately. Take me to Marrowcliff and I will pay you $50. That amount of money would mean that he could make the repairs on some of his traps. It would also mean that he would be traveling into a busy town where there were lots of people. He didn't do so well in crowds. But it was $50. Please, she said thickly. He met that mesmerizing green look of hers. You know, that's the first genuine thing that you've said since you've arrived, he said. I'll take you, but... He held out a finger when she stepped towards her belongings. She halted and sent him a querying look. It can't be today. But it must be today. Now, in fact. The weather is fine and... I already told you, this is the calm before it hits again. I can smell it in the air. She looked out of the window, and he saw the sheer desperation in her eyes when her gaze swung back. I can't stay here. I'm not married. It's not right to be alone with a man unchaperoned. It was Hal's turn to be puzzled. What kind of thief is worried about her virtue and reputation? I didn't say to move in, he snapped. I meant to have some food, get some strength back. Then you can get on to whomever it is you're trying to get to, or away from. Her rump met the bed once more. Her tears made little drip stains on her lap, but it was the soft sniffles that almost undid him. He hated it when a woman cried. He sighed again and felt his resolve lessen. He took a step towards her, though stopped when she flinched. I won't hurt you, he patted the air. I will take you to Marrowcliff once the storm passes. How long? Her voice was so quiet he wouldn't have known she'd spoken if he hadn't been looking at her downcast profile. He made an assessment based on his past experience. A day, 2 tops. The journey itself is a day's ride in this weather. She lifted her face and looked through the window. Her tear-stained expression made something shift inside him. Fine. Very well. Are you hungry? Her green gaze met his. There it was again, that little bump to his pulse that unnerved him as much as having the possibility of having the sheriff here chasing a fugitive. She nodded, her mouth compressing into a line. "I made broth," he told, grateful to have something to occupy his hands with. He ladled the hot liquid into a bowl and put it down on the table. She took her seat, sweeping her skirts under herself before sitting. She was used to eating at a dining table. Even the way she sipped delicately from the spoon spoke class. He wondered if she needed a napkin, though she didn't complain about the lack of dining facilities. "I need to get more firewood and check the traps near the house." Alarm flared in her eyes when he spoke. "You're leaving? I'll be here. If you get a desire to run again, the road is due west." His hand flatted into a line to show her. "There are furs on the back of the door. Put them on. Head through the gap in the tree line. There's a sort of path between the trees, though we'll lose light again in about 2 hours. You might just about make it to the road before dark." Her eyes followed the taps his hand had made, though she didn't move. "I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Wyman." Hal escaped out into the fresh, crisp daylight. The air was scented with pine and wood smoke, though the skyline was starting to simmer already with gray storm clouds. Kite trotted cheerfully about the yard, marking his spots and sniffing out the corners. Ordinarily, Hal would have pottered about the space contentedly. 2 of the traps held a decent catch, and he'd eat well. But his mind was full of questions about his visitor. He wasn't worried about her stealing from him. He had nothing of value, certainly nothing that a woman would have much use for. He stacked the wood up on the deck. A glance through the window showed him that she'd returned to the cot and was facing away from him. Sharing his space with another person made him twitchy. He could deal with people, but they were usually other traders who liked their solitude too. Any exchanges were brief and practical. He rarely spoke with women, especially one who was so feminine. He stepped off the porch, dragging his mind from wanting to linger on her form. He filled a bucket with snow to melt for water, added some hard feed to another bucket, and hauled everything into the hut where he kept his horse. Emotions brought pain. Speaking with others meant that they tended to study his face, and the whole experience unnerved him, except she hadn't stared at him out of curiosity. She avoided his stare as much as she circumvented his questions. She'd been so preoccupied with her own thoughts. Degenerate or victim? She was as twitchy as a sinner, and yet sipped delicately from the bowl and patted her lips like she was using a linen napkin. So many things didn't add up. Her clothes looked prosperous, but were they hers? He'd not even broached the subject of how she'd come by the bruising to her face. He wasn't sure she could raise $50, though her trinkets would fetch that if sold collectively. If she paid him with profits from her crimes, would that link him to it? He expelled a breath, irritated that he cared so much about her. He shoved a handful of hay into the corner and ran a hand along the bay's hind flank as the horse tucked into his supper. She's the one who'd told him it was just business. She was right. It was nothing to do with him, just as it was not his concern what happened to her after he'd left her in Marrowcliff. Take the money, Hal, and try to forget all about her. He latched the door behind him just as the snowflakes tumbled from the sky. He knew deep down that forgetting her was going to be easier said than done. Chapter 5. The subsequent storm lasted 2 days. In that time, as the winds had lashed the tiny cabin, they'd circled each other warily within the cramped space. He'd tried to engage her on a few occasions, though her reticence seemed to have finally won, and he'd fallen into a brooding silence. She watched the tree line. She longed for a clock to know the hour of the day. She paced. She waited. The only saving grace about being trapped in the woods was that Frey's men wouldn't have been able to search for her. Any prints that she'd have made would have been scrubbed. She ate the meat that he roasted over the open fire. She drank from the metal bucket in the corner. And she tried to ignore what happened to her skin every time she found him watching her. Sleeping was impossible, yet she did sleep, lulled by the crackle and hiss of the logs. When she woke that morning and saw that the sky had blue in it, her relief was palpable. She stepped out into the bright morning sunshine and had had to blink a few times to get clear on what she was looking at. No wagon, no buggy, just a single horse. She wanted to object, but she was so desperate to escape both the area and his presence that she'd gritted her teeth and allowed him to lift her up onto the saddle. She had to sit astride, which felt unnatural to her. He'd tied her makeshift bag to the travois at the back of them, along with a bundle of skins and a sack that he'd explained had ammunition and other tools in should he need it. She had scooted herself as far forward as she could, though when he'd swung up and settled in behind her, suddenly Frey's men were the least of her problems. Everything inside her seemed to scream with cognizance. His arms were loose around her waist, pressure increasing on one side when he shifted the reins to guide their ride through the thicket of trees. His breath fanned the back of her neck, and she regretted pulling her long red plate over her shoulder, exposing her skin to him. Not even the furs that he'd insisted she wear for warmth could disguise the sensation of resting her back against the wall of his chest. Her spine ached from keeping herself rigid. Daylight peeped through the trees, and she could see the path that he was following, delineated by a gap between the bony trunks. Snow peppered the ground, though. She could see that they weren't the first creatures to venture out that day, from the prints pressed into the dappled path. "The road is to our left, about a half-mile," his voice rumbled through his chest, which sent shivers sliding along her back. "This path mostly runs perpendicular to it. I've tried to stay off it for as long as possible, but we need to turn off this path and meet the road to get to Marrowcliff." Hal steered their horse through the trees, and she could see where the land rose and then split for a more trodden pathway. As they got closer, she spotted the road ahead. It was marked by sledding lines and had churned to mud where the water collected into puddles along the tree edge. She'd admired the landscape upon her arrival at Frey's home. Even now, the snow lay on the green boughs, sparkling in the sunlight. The air was fresh and earthy. The silence was so different from the frenetic noise and dirty streets of Boston. She'd believed that she could have made a home here before Frey had shown her his true nature. She had to swallow before trusting her voice not to wobble. "Are you sure that we're not going back towards Rusty Ridge?" He clicked his tongue, and the pressure of his chest against her back increased as he shifted their weight to allow his horse to climb the sharp incline up to the road. He twisted in the saddle to check the travois. "More than sure." Sorry," she murmured, willing her body to come back under her control after the pressure change of his body against hers made her heart trip over itself. "It's just, Sorry, I didn't mean to question you. No harm in asking that. I know this land like the back of my hand," he replied. "I've lived here for the best part of a decade, and I made a promise to you that no harm would come to you whilst you were with me. I meant it. Whatever is in Rusty Ridge that is making you so skittish is behind us." Her sigh of relief puffed out into the air. It didn't bear thinking about what Bruce was up to. Putting the distance between them was all that she cared about. Instead, she turned her mind to the man who was wrapped about her. Hal's comment about living here for a while was the most that he'd revealed about himself since she'd woken up in his cot. And for the first time, she wondered how he'd come to be in that cabin in the middle of nowhere. He lived frugally and alone. He was gruff and rude, but had a softer side. She'd seen it when he'd tended to his animals. He'd been nothing but polite to her. What of his past? She wondered if it had anything to do with the puckered skin down his cheek. She'd seen a similar crumpling on the back of his hand that disappeared up his sleeve when he'd stoked the fire. Her mind raced ahead, and she was grateful for the reprieve from worrying over Bruce Frey. "What waits for you at the end of your train ride?" His quiet question blasted through her contemplation. She pressed her lips together at the sudden onslaught of emotions brought on by memories of home. Her mother's rosy cheeks and her father's hearty laugh when she'd sing for them and dance a little jig. The rousing piano tunes that she'd play on Christmas Eve. She wanted to be there for it all this year. Now, more than ever, she needed her family around her. Her own bed. To feel safe. Her mother would undoubtedly have the tree up, strung with ribbons and burgeoned with her trinkets. Cinnamon and berries would scent the grand hallway. Cook would be clucking about the kitchen, bossing the maids around as she catered to her mother's ridiculously demanding whims. She wondered if her mother had even bothered with leaving her a gift under the tree, or if Ebba had finally managed to break her mother's heart completely this time by running off to the other side of the country. When did you last go horseback riding? The second question jarred her thoughts. What? You don't strike me as the type who's ridden many horses. His warm breath fanned her cheek, and she closed her eyes. What type am I? She asked, breathlessly. The silence stretched on for a few moments. She longed to look at him, but refrained. I don't know, Jane. His tone told her that he wasn't happy about being kept in the dark. I do know that you don't like prying questions, but we're going to be like this for a few hours. Horseback riding can be unpleasant if you're not used to it. Talking might take your mind off things if you're not comfortable. He'd picked up on her pulling away from him and mistook it for her being in pain. She was uncomfortable, and it had nothing to do with the saddle. The words leaped to her lips. I was thinking about how it's almost Christmas. He didn't answer at first. The only sounds were the click and crunch of hooves punctuating the soft hiss of the travois poles dragging behind them. I suppose it is. His response sounded rough, with a tang of rawness that rippled over her ear. You'd have your pick of the best trees, living where you do, she said, and was rewarded with his dry chuckle. Then it's a good job I don't bother with it. 77%. Kite would happily stay in the warm for the winter, and with a tree inside, he'd have absolutely no need to go out till the spring. The laugh that bubbled up eased the tightness in her chest somewhat. How did you come by a dog like that in the middle of nowhere? Did you trade something for him? She felt the instant she'd broken the truce between them by the way that he stilled. Silence descended. Hal Wyman didn't like any prying either. She gained a little understanding of why he lived the way he did when she wondered about what secrets he was keeping. I inherited him, he replied after a time. There's water in that canteen if you need it. Ebba frowned. The subject change shut down any further questions. She took a sip from the canteen, though her head bumped his shoulder as she did, and she quickly placed the lid back on and hooked it back on the saddle. The trees were beginning to thin out, and she could make out the uneven outline of hills ahead. Can I hear water? Yes, he replied. We'll be crossing the river just around this bend. Eyes searching, she saw the ribbon of water then, part frozen, peeping through the trees. Hal brought them to a stop and let loose a curse. What is it? His heavy sigh whispered past her ear. You see those wooden posts sticking out the ground? I do. She could see a matching set on the opposite riverbank, but it was the spindly knot of branches and ropes that dangled from the opposite bank that made her sit up. How do we cross? We don't, Hal muttered. The storm must have brought the bridge down. No bridge? She did turn then, leaning away to stare at his harsh profile. His eyes were narrowed against the glare of the sunlight, moving along the horizon. Then how do we get to the other side? We don't, he repeated curtly. We must turn back. There's no other way? Fright coursed through her. She couldn't stay here. Frey's men would surely be out searching for her. There is, but it's back towards Rusty Ridge, probably another half-day's ride from here. It's a much tougher route, longer, more hazardous. I'll increase your fee to $70. Desperation turned her voice shrill, and we must go now. A muscle ticked in his jaw. Hope nudged inside when she saw that he was considering the idea. She pushed again. I can't go back to Rusty Ridge. Hal's gaze met hers then. She blinked at the sheen of moisture in her eyes. He was silent for a moment as he looked at her. There's a way through, but it's up and over the pass. It's treacherous at best. If the storm was severe enough to take the bridge out, then the pass will be blocked too. It's the only way that avoids Rusty Ridge. We'll have to wait a day or so and pray that this sun stays. If it thaws a little, we can make it through. I'll need more equipment, more supplies. We can't go today. You've done it before? Alone, yes? You're sure there's no other way? Well, Jane, you could chance your arm at swimming across? His tone dripped with sarcasm. Though I dare say you'd freeze to death long before you drowned. That river is probably your fastest way to the next territory. How about it? Ebba broke the stare then to look at what was left of the bridge. No, thank you. Didn't think so, he muttered. Hal turned them around and began to follow back along the path they'd made. Misery pulled in her all directions. She yearned for family, for home. But for now, she was trapped in the middle of nowhere with the grouchy stranger who was growing more resentful of her company by the minute. Chapter 6. Hal backed in through the door, his arms laden with firewood. He ordered Kite in through the door and kicked it shut behind them both. A cursory glance around the space told him that his house guest had made herself useful once again and had cleaned up the breakfast things. Blankets were folded neatly on the chairs. His coat hung on the door hooks. Her belongings were stored back in her pack. He surreptitiously wiped his feet before he walked across the floor and dropped the logs into the basket next to the hearth. "Has it snowed again?" she asked. "No, nothing fresh," he said. "But the temperature hasn't lifted by much. We still have to wait a day or two." He tried not to take her bitter disappointment to heart. She wasn't happy about being delayed any more than he liked sharing his space. "Tomorrow? I'm going to say the day after," he replied as he stoked the fire. "And we'll have to leave before first light." She'd taken to sitting at the table, and he wondered how she passed her time before she'd arrived here. She struck him as someone who read much, rather than someone who would perhaps embroider for fun. But he had no books here anymore. His embroidery tools were used for stitching hides together and repairing anything he needed to stay warm. He sat back on his haunches and waited for the flames to crackle to life when Kite yipped into the silence that stretched between them. The sudden intrusion of sound gave them both a start. Jane popped to her feet. "That's his people bark," he muttered, waving her back down. "Someone's here?" "Yes, stay out of the way." Hal approached the window cautiously, though he had already picked up on the signs of people in his yard. Twigs snapping under hooves and the rumble of unfamiliar voices. Sure enough, 3 riders were milling about. Kite's barking grew in veracity. Hal looked back at where the young woman was frozen to the spot, her features slack with terror. "Hal," she whispered, her green eyes filling with tears. "I'm sorry that I've got you involved in this." "Who are they?" She blinked, the action pushing tears over her lids. "They're here for me. I can't go back with him. Please, help me." Her pleas squeezed his chest. He wasn't sure what it was about her, but he wanted to protect her. "Hide, Jane," he instructed her. Her eyes swung wildly about the small space. "Where?" Hal strode to the center of the room and nudged back the bearskin rug that covered the floor. He revealed a small trap door with a ring. Hal bent and pulled to uncover a narrow crawl space under the floor. "In here," he gestured, looking towards the window as one of the riders dismounted. Kite went wild, bouncing at the door. Hal was grateful for the dog disguising their exchange. "Quickly, stay quiet, I'll get rid of them." Without hesitation, Jane climbed down into the musty space. Hal shut the door and flipped the rug back to hide it before he yelled at Kite to quiet down. Hal dragged open the front door and allowed his rifle to hang down from his grip. "Can I help you, fellas?" The one who dismounted stopped a few feet from the end of the porch. He pulled down the bandana that covered the lower half of his face. "We weren't sure anyone was home." Hal looked at them, one at a time. The one at the back was older, heavier set. All were bundled up against the elements. A 4th riderless horse was tethered to his ride. "Are you lost?" "No, sir," the one in the yard replied. "I'm Ricky. That's my foreman, Bud Walton," he indicated the older man. "And that is Dee." "Okay, what do you want?" "Misty." Ricky chuckled lightly, his hands flipping back the edges of his overcoat to show the twin pistols that were seated at his hips. "This your place?" "Sure is." "Bud said that there was a cabin out here in the boondocks. Guess I didn't believe him," Ricky said. Hal remained mute, allowing them to have their shared joke. Kite sat at side, watchful eyes on the trio. "We're looking for somebody," Bud announced. "A woman." Hal spread his arms wide and grinned. "Ain't we all, but I'm afraid I'm fresh out of women today." Ricky and Dee guffawed bodily, but Bud wasn't amused. "You can't miss this one. She's got hair as bright as fire with an attitude that will burn you." Hal shrugged. "Sounds like you're well rid. Red-headed women are nothing but trouble in my experience." "Try telling that to our boss," Ricky laughed knowingly. "She had him under her spell with her feminine ways." Bud cut through the male laughter. "It ain't funny to leave a man at the altar." Hal folded his arms and leaned against the door jamb, the butt of his rifle resting next to his boot. She did that, huh? Sure did. A promise is a promise. How long ago did she leave? 3 days. Hal pursed his lips, deliberately looking through the trees. We had those bad storms. She can't have gone far. Bud leaned forward and rested an arm on his pommel. That's what I said, but the woman has vanished. A lone wolf will have had her by now if she ain't beneath a snowdrift. She'll turn up in the spring, probably. Hal straightened up and made to leave. No tracks to follow other than the ones we followed here. We have a whole team of men out searching for her. A team? Hal's brows shot up. For one woman? Mr. Frey isn't a patient man. Bruce Frey. No wonder she was terrified. He knew the mine owner through reputation alone. Hal lived away from the population, but traders talked. Frey was a large employer in the area. I'd heard that about him, Hal remarked. Seems to me that if your Mr. Frey was as heartbroken as you claim by her absconding, he'd be here himself asking these questions. The three men all looked at each other. He's a busy man, Bud said. Hal held his gaze for a beat before he said, The tracks you followed were probably where I tried to make it to Marrowcliff. I have furs to trade, but the bridge is out. I had to turn back. Why didn't you go by road? Dee asked. It's easier going than through the trees and the deep snow. It's a direct route across the way, Hal stated evenly. You have to admit that it's a bit suspicious. A trapper not going by the fastest route, though. Hal didn't respond. The rumbling growl in Kite's throat increased as Ricky stepped forward. He leaned in to try and see through the partially open doorway from where he stood. Hal tilted his head in query. What are you looking for, fella? The two other men dismounted and approached Hal, though he didn't move from his relaxed stance. Mr. Frey asked us to check every building in the area, Bud explained. There's been no one through here in weeks. He pays us well to be thorough. So my word isn't good enough for you? Ricky shrugged, edged closer. We're just doing our jobs as we see fit. And a woman like Ebba Frampton can do funny things to a man, what with her feminine wiles and witchy ways. Hal's eyes turned flinty. I live alone. Check the barn, Dee. Dee took barely a few steps before Hal brought his rifle up to his shoulder, cocked back the hammer. There's no one here. I'm telling you that. I don't care for people going through my stuff, any more than I care for unannounced visitors. Be on your way. The trio didn't move, though Ricky had tucked the edges of his coat out of the way. They all stared at each other. With a sigh, Hal used his foot to nudge back the door so that the men could see the limited space of the cabin. Neatly made cot, folded blankets, clean floor. Frey's vixen isn't here. Now I'm going to politely ask that you take yourselves off my property again. The third time won't be so hospitable. For a moment, Hal's senses screamed for attention. He wondered just how he'd come to be embroiled in this fight that wasn't his for a woman who'd lied to him. And then, Bud sighed and wheeled about. They each climbed back up onto their rides with a final instruction from Bud to let them know if he happened across this heathen who'd broken his boss's heart. Hal waited until they'd cleared the yard before he shut the door. He waited another 15 minutes. After Kite had returned without giving his warning bark, Hal opened the trap door. Green eyes stared up at him. With a sigh, he held out a hand and pulled her out of the hole. She brushed at the cobwebs and dust at her skirts and ran a careful hand over the flaming red hair that she'd braided over her shoulder. He waited until she stopped fussing before he spoke. Bruce Frey put those bruises on you, didn't he? Chapter 7. Of all the questions she thought he'd ask, that one hadn't occurred to her. She'd lied to him. She'd unwittingly made him an accomplice in her drama. She did not doubt that those men whom he'd been speaking with would return. He asked a question, but it sounded more like a statement. Ebba nodded. Yes. Did you hear what they were saying? Not really. Her eyes slid to the window, to the landscape beyond. It was muffled, and Kite kept growling. Have they definitely left? Yes, but they'll be back. They'll want to check the barns. He always gets his way, she murmured, recalling Bruce's boastful claims as he locked the bedroom door. Who's he? You mean Frey? She half turned to him and caught the annoyance that flickered over his face. She wavered on the edge of indecision. Is he a friend of yours? Hal snorted. I don't have friends. But you know him? Of him, Hal corrected. He owns a local mine. Some of the traders have dealings with him and with the men that he's employed. I can tell you that he isn't very well thought of in these parts. Ebba remembered the people who were willing to do his bidding, who'd refused to help her escape as they decorated his lavish home for Christmas. Some people will do anything for him, she replied softly. Money can buy you a lot of things, including loyalty. Were you promised to him? Ebba felt the heat of shame rush to her cheeks, and she turned away from him. I agreed to marry him, yes, but that was before I really knew him. Hal didn't say anything. Ebba risked a glance at him to find him watching her with an unreadable gaze. She looked away, feigning interest in the fire, in anywhere that wasn't under that direct stare. The things in your pack, you didn't steal them from him? She gasped, stung that he would still be questioning her. No, I already told you that they're mine. I left everything else I brought with me from Boston at his place. I wanted to get away from him. I left what can be replaced behind, but those things in that pack are all very sentimental to me. Hal crossed to the window and dropped the cloth over the aperture. Why don't you tell me what happened? A bubble of laughter rose in her throat. Why would I? You already think I'm lying. You have lied to me, he pointed out. Ebba's mouth parted, but she bit back the words. She couldn't argue with that logic. Is your name Ebba Frampton? She studied his angular face in the dim light. Hearing her name on his lips caused uneasy ripples through her belly. Yes. Well, at least that part I believe. What else did those men say? He pointed at the cot. Sit. Ebba folded her arms and cocked a hip, her chin inching up in challenge. You don't bark at me like I'm a pet. Hal dragged the chair across the floor to the bed, his jaw tight when he sat on it. I'm starting to get an idea why Bruce Frey might have grown frustrated with you. Bruce Frey is a bully and a horrible brute, Ebba scoffed. He has the manners of a gutter snipe and about as much sense as the rocks he blows up. He laughed low in his throat, rubbing at the spot between his brows. The sound was rusty as if it wasn't used often. His eyes sparkled with mirth, which sent her pulse racing when he met her gaze once more. A reluctant smile tugged at her lips. Please sit, he indicated to the cot. If I am to harbor you from the likes of Frey, I'd at least like to know what I'm getting myself into. I want the truth too. Ebba sat down slowly. She reminded herself that he'd sent Frey's men away. He'd protected her when he could have simply shown them where she was hiding. By doing so, he'd probably aroused suspicion. Still, Bruce had only been with her for one reason. She came from wealth. In her experience, money could not only buy loyalty, but it also changed people. We're not moving until you tell me what happened. Ebba considered him, her forehead furrowed. He no longer hid the disfigurement. His gaze was steady as he looked back at her. His elbows were on his thighs, and he leaned forward. Ebba, his voice was low, like a caress, and caused her stomach to clench. She slowly released her breath. A friend of mine showed me a magazine that had adverts from men seeking love. I answered one of those. That's what brought me here. His good brow slid up. That's the unabridged version. How about a bit more detail? The friend had been her lady's maid. They'd become friends, giggling and excited by the possibilities that lay between the pages of the paper. But she couldn't reveal that she had servants. He proposed, I answered. I arrived by train. Her eyes dropped to the floor as she recalled the excitement that had gripped her for the entire journey. No one else in her circle had seen the sights that had passed by the windows of the racing train. How the mountains disappeared into the clouds or fell away to sparkling rivers and lakes far below the tracks. She'd been stunned by the beauty of God's creation, the blend of passengers all on a path of their own. Maybe there were lone women on the way to meet their loves and start a new life. For she had loved Bruce Frey, or at least the sweet and charming man who'd written such pretty prose to her. Hal waited patiently, the firelight making his face glow as he simply watched her. It was easier to look at the flames than to see the pity that she imagined in his eyes. He wasn't at the station waiting for me as he'd said. I was disappointed, but the cowhand who'd been sent to fetch me informed me that Mr. Frey was too busy to run such a lowly errand. The man he sent, well, she met his gaze fleetingly before it went back to the hearth. He wasn't all that bright. Under some pertinent questions, the man slipped up and told me that I hadn't been writing to Bruce at all. He'd paid a woman to write those letters. Remembered humiliation churned inside her, and she blinked to stave off the tears. At first, I was touched. I thought that perhaps Bruce couldn't write, that he'd fallen in love with me anyway and didn't want to put me off. Turns out, I wasn't the only woman he'd been sending those letters to. I was just the first one to arrive off the train. The following day, another young woman turned up. Bruce put us in the room together. I thought perhaps she was a lady's maid when I saw her. I introduced myself as his fiancée, and the young woman was understandably devastated. We were both mortified when Bruce began to make physical comparisons between us. I'm afraid I lost my temper. He threw her out and Ebba cleared her throat, unconsciously touching the yellowing bruises on her face. He wouldn't allow me to leave. One of his employees stood on the other side of the door. I was brought a sandwich and a dress to wear. Bruce came into the room later and told me that we were to be married the next day. I laughed at him. He'd misled me. He wasn't the man I'd been writing to. He'd brought me to Rusty Ridge under false pretenses. I calmly advised him that I would be heading back to Boston the next day. As you can imagine, Bruce Frey isn't a man who cares to be mocked. Prosody? I was told that I couldn't leave him, that I was the one he'd picked, that he was an important man who always gets his way. Hal finished the sentence for her. Yes, she murmured. My rebuttal of his proposal made him very mad. How could I marry someone who had lied in such a terrible way? He didn't care that he'd thrown out that poor young girl, nor did he give any consideration as to what had happened to her. We argued. He said that he would break me like a filly, that I would learn my place. I was disgusted by him. When I tried to leave, she gestured to her face. After that, he didn't want the mayor to see his handiwork, so he put the wedding off by 2 days. He told me that that was enough time for me to make my face better, or else. I tried to reason with the maids he had in his house, but I could tell that they were all scared of him. One of them told me that there was a home station at Marrowcliff. I remembered the last big train station was Wolfburg. I was locked in an upstairs bedroom. I left through the window, believing that I could walk to the swing station town. How long were you outside in that storm? She shrugged. Her recollection was hazy at best. I'm not sure. How far away is Fry's place? About 5 miles in a straight line, but there's a quarry and a mine that separates us. You could have easily fallen into either one. I'd say someone was watching over you that night. A wry smile curled her lips. That's something my mother would say. She sounds like a wise woman, Hal offered. Your parents are alive? Ebba nodded. They are. My mother was heartbroken that her only child took off to marry a stranger. And your father? He lets me have my way. I wish that this was one of those times when he'd put his foot down. I hardly think that that would have made a difference. Had that been the case, it would have been their bedroom window that you were climbing out of. She huffed out a little laugh at that truthful snippet. I'd like to argue that point, but I'd be wrong. So what happens now? Hal held her eyes for a moment. Then he inhaled sharply and slapped his hand to his thighs. Then he pressed to his feet. We had an agreement. We go ahead with the plan to go via the pass. Although, yes, Wolfburg has a train station. It's further away, but it will be your quickest way back to wherever home is. Home is Boston, she relented. Surprise shimmered in his eyes, and he acknowledged her comment with a head dip. It's your quickest way, and that's what you're paying me for. Of course, Ebba replied, trying not to let the disappointment show. That was why he'd protected her from Fry's men, not because he was being chivalrous in saving her and protecting her. He wanted to be paid. She'd do well to remember that his concern was nothing more than taking in the facts so that he could help her get home. $70, wasn't it? His face was dark and impassive. For a moment, he looked every bit as dangerous as she'd imagined. He inclined his head. And you'll be home in time for Christmas. Chapter 8. Wolfburg was much busier than anticipated. Being this close to this many people made his skin crawl, and he longed for the sanctuary of his mountain. They'd left before first light, and had crested the pass just as the sun broke through the dawn clouds. The warmer weather had meant that they'd made better time than he'd predicted. He'd left the travois at home this time so as not to hamper their journey. "It feels strange being among all these people," she spoke quietly, but he was so tuned into her that he picked up on the nervous energy rolling from her. "Didn't you grow up in Boston?" He caught the small smile that she made as her eyes moved about the busy streets. "Yes, it's just as hectic here." "The train station makes it a hub for lots of people," he said and turned along 2nd Street. "Plus, there are only a few days left before Christmas," she said. Shoppers hurried along the damp sidewalks, laden with parcels that were tied with string. Windows had been dressed up festively, and he was reminded once again that other people shared in the festivities, whereas he preferred to let anything to do with family to pass him by. "Most people will be getting organized for that. My mother will be in full party preparation, driving my poor father crazy. They have beef and sometimes goose," she said, her voice animated when she spoke of going back to her old life. "I wouldn't know about that." "You never celebrated Christmas?" "No," his curt reply made her flinch, and he was glad. He'd spent most of his day trying to keep his mind away from thinking about just how well her body melded against his in the saddle. It was times like this that he wished he'd invested in a wagon. She hadn't helped the situation. She didn't once complain about how uncomfortable she must be. A couple of times she'd relaxed against his chest, and he'd almost forgotten that they were riding away from danger. She wasn't his to think about. It would be all too easy to imagine a life filled with pretty green eyes and creamy skin, and that made everything dangerous for him. She'd not grumbled about the lack of food choices or being stuck in his cabin. She complied with his requests. She'd helped around his cabin. He wasn't sure his cabin had ever been so clean and organized. Living with her was all too easy, and it made him edgy. He intended to collect his payment and get back to his life just as soon as he saw her onto the train. "Are you sure there's a train station here?" She pushed back her hood to get a better view of the town and all its frenetic activity. "Keep your hood up," Hal growled at her. "Frey's men won't be out here," she said, but tugged the hood back up anyway. "Do you know that for certain?" "Well, no," she relented. "This is a far cry from Rusty Ridge." "It's not that far by road." His eyes scanned the street as awareness prickled across his skin. He turned again and glanced back along the road they'd just walked down, trying to pick out what had caught his attention. "It's starting to get dark, and we're surrounded by all these people. I'll need a place to stay if there's no train." "What's wrong?" she asked. He straightened up, holding the reins and her in one arm as his fingers slipped the buckle off his rifle holster. "Something," he said, "or someone." He felt her tense against him, and he gritted his teeth, senses on alert, and his blood thrummed. He turned into the road that was bordered by several hotels, stores, and lodges to cater to the train passengers. The ticket office was still open, with gas lights on either side of the entrance casting a glow across the plaza. People hurried along the street, all with somewhere to be, but the men standing sentinel around the station entrance snagged his attention. They were watchful, leaning, patiently watching the crowds that surged around them. In the mayhem, they stood out like sore thumbs. Hal looked for ways to exit. When he rotated in the saddle to check behind him, he found the source of his uneasiness. Ricky was walking along the sidewalk towards the station. He wasn't looking at them. Hal hoped that meant that they'd not been spotted, but he wasn't taking any chances. He dug his heels into his horse's ribs and turned immediately to their right. They nipped between the buildings as shouts erupted behind them. "What is it?" Ebba called, but Hal concentrated on negotiating the barrels and detritus along the alley. He turned onto Main Street and pushed his horse into a canter, ignoring the protesting bellows from the buggies and riders that they cut up. "Hal, what's wrong? I need to get on the train." "Frey's men all over the place," he muttered. His mind raced. The road was the fastest way back to his cabin. It would also be the safest rather than trying to negotiate the pass in the darkness. His horse carried 2 people and they'd been riding all day. He couldn't ask much more of his horse. If Frey's men had recognized him, they'd come for her anyway. However, he knew the lay of the land around his cabin better than anybody else. He could protect her if he could see them coming. When the township was far below them and they were hidden by the trees, he drew to a halt. The horse's nostrils flared, puffing its breath into the icy evening air. "Are you sure it was them? The man who called himself Ricky? I saw him walking towards the station." "What now?" she asked. "Where's the next train station?" Hal scratched his chin, casting aside every scenario that his mind conjured up. "Perhaps moving you to the next territory might be an idea." "I should go to the sheriff. Have them deal with those men. A sheriff will see that I have safe passage." Hal shook his head. "Someone like Frey will probably have the lawman in his pocket. I know that you wanted to be home for Christmas, but we need a different plan." She looked up at him then, her green eyes searching his face. He could have simply dropped her off and walked away, but the thought of those men getting their grubby hands on her ignited a possessiveness that he had no right in feeling. She merely nodded, and he clicked his tongue, pointing the horse back to the cabin. The moon lit their way along the road. He heard the light hiccup and could tell from the way that she was trembling that she was crying. He wondered if it was the thought of missing her family Christmas, or the fact that she was stuck with him that was making her cry. The fire crackled in the hearth, flames dancing over the logs. The wind slapped the tumbling snow flurries against the window. Bruce Frey held up the crystal tumbler and studied how the firelight refracted through the whiskey. "You sure it was her?" His foreman Bud Walton fidgeted a little, and Bruce switched his attention to the old man threading the brim of his hat through crooked fingers. "Ricky claims it was her. He saw Bud pointed to his shiny palette. Her hair, but she had a hood and it was busy. He lost them in the crowds." "Them? Well, she was with someone." Bud switched back under Frey's impassive glare. "A man." The glass struck the desk, the motion sloshing the whiskey across the surface. "Who?" Bud swallowed. "We don't know, boss. I thought it was telling that she was so far out." Bruce jumped up and paced to the window, even though the storm obliterated his views of his land. "I want to speak with Ricky." Bruce ignored the sigh he heard his foreman make. He paid the man to do his bidding, not to judge how he ran his life. Footsteps retreated as the foreman hobbled away. Humiliation burned a hole in his guts. He should forget about her, but it was hard to put a woman who looked as good as she did out of his mind. Harder still when she was loaded. A man needed some company on nights like this. He needed the touch of a woman in his home and an heir to carry on his line. His last wife had been too weak and hadn't survived childbirth. The child hadn't fared better either. Clearly inherited that trait from its mother. The adverts had been a last-ditch attempt to keep his bed warm when some of the replies came from women with money. The upshot of marrying a woman of substance meant that he could inject some much-needed cash into his floundering mine. He was on the precipice of losing everything. He needed Ebba Frampton under him in more ways than one. "You needed to see me, boss." Bruce didn't bother gracing him with a look. "You saw her?" There was a slight hesitation, and Bruce rounded on his employee. "Yes," Ricky stuttered. "It was her." "How much would you wager on it?" A month's salary that it was her. Bruce's mouth compressed as he nodded appreciatively. That meant he was more than certain. "What about the man she was with? You get a look at him?" Ricky and Bud exchanged a look. Bruce fisted his hands on his hips. "What? I didn't see him," Ricky hedged. But what? I think I know who it was. We've seen him before." Ricky looked at the old foreman as if seeking permission. Bud rolled his eyes. "We checked there already." "Only what I could see. We didn't look everywhere," Ricky whined. "What is he talking about?" Bruce demanded, glaring at his foreman. "The cabin up at Eagle's Pass?" Bud said, and then sighed again. "We followed some tracks there a few days ago. The fellow was none too pleased to have us snooping, but showed us in the cabin." "The trapper?" Fury licked through him. "The rundown place was high up in the forest, away from civilization." "That freak has her?" "There was no sign of her there. Ricky is assuming he saw what he saw." Bruce rocked back on his heels. "Didn't he kill his wife?" "I don't know about that," Bud began. "His face is all scarred up," Ricky supplied. "He wasn't too pleased to have us poking about on his land, pulled a gun on me, suggested that you ought to be there looking for her yourself if she meant that much to you." "Shut it, Ricky," Bud hissed, eyeing his changeable boss like a two-headed snake. Bruce dead-eyed them both. It could be that the man was just another crazy trapper protective of his property. It could be that the trapper had something of value that belonged to him. It could be that the trapper needed his teeth knocking down his throat. He leveled a finger at his men. "You go back up there and take a look-see." In fact, he added before either could protest, his belly firing up at the prospect of being able to drag her out of the trapper's lair, kicking and screaming. "I'll go with you. She is my bride, after all." Chapter 9. Ebba? The gruff voice was accompanied by a soft nudge. She longed to slide back into her deep slumber, but the jostle got stronger this time. "We're back." She came to slowly, blinking at the darkness. The moonlight was bright and crisp, casting its eerie light over the small enclosure. "You're going to have to sit up," Hal said quietly. "I don't want you to fall." She realized then the reason why she was so warm. She'd fallen asleep under the blanket he'd wrapped around her. The gentle rocking motion of the horse's gait, coupled with the heat generated by the contact of their bodies, meant she'd been cocooned within the frame of his arms. The chest that she'd been so adamant not to touch earlier flexed as he switched rein hands. Instantly, she sat bolt upright. "Sorry." "No matter," he muttered as he swung down from the saddle. He then held his hands up to assist her down. She reached out to him only because she didn't trust her legs and not because touching him seemed to ease her worry. After the tension caused by the rapid departure from Wolfburg, her nerves felt stretched to breaking point. It seemed that every escape route had been closed off. Hal helped her into the cabin. He lit an oil lamp and left her alone in the silence. Her situation had felt helpless, and yet, now that she was back here, she felt impervious to the perils of Frey's men. Hal went outside to tend to the animals, Kite bringing up the rear. She looked around the sparsely furnished dwelling. Shivers hammered her body, and so she set about lighting the fire. By the time Hal returned, she had the fire lit and had begun the makings of a stew. Dried meat and refried beans with melted snow. He drew up short, his good brow climbing when he walked back in, an armful of firewood. She held up a hand. Cooking is not. She thought about the servants that her parents employed, the lavish feasts that were spread along the grand dining tables. She'd been in the kitchen with the cook plenty enough times to have watched how to do the basics. "I can't promise it will be edible, but if all else fails, Kite will be well fed." His mouth twisted into a smile. He dropped the logs at the hearth. "It will certainly be better than my efforts." She stirred the mush in the pan whilst he added a log under it, their eyes meeting. "Thank you for today." His eyes dropped and he shrugged self-consciously. "I'm sorry that you're not sitting on a train right now miles away from here." Melancholy flooded her. He wanted to be rid of her. He wanted to be paid. Before she could evaluate much further, he continued, "I've been thinking about things during the ride back. I think that I may have come up with a plan, a better one." She remained quiet, focusing on the bubbling mix. "Frey's men are watching the main routes out of here, but there are other routes that are not as expeditious. You could move with traders along the backcountry routes. They often travel along the passes, trading goods and swapping stories." "Routes that you've traveled?" "Some," he replied. "I'd need to speak with a few trappers and see which of them are intending on moving toward the Dakotas or even Wyoming. The thing is, you'd avoid Frey doing it this way, but you won't be back in Boston in time for Christmas." "I'd be going on my own?" He sat back on his haunches and considered her. "I'd make sure that the traders were the more trustworthy ones. We just need to move you to the biggest train station we can find in the next territory. Frey can't watch the ones further away." Now she knew what the disappointment was. She felt safe with him, but he seemed determined to get rid of her. More so, she would be leaving him behind. "We'll leave in the morning to go and find these traders?" His calm gaze met hers and regarded her steadily. "Trappers are a naturally mistrustful group. They're businessmen first, but are always paranoid that they're being tricked. Some of them will know Frey or one of his associates. I need to make the deal and do it discreetly." His hand indicated his hair. Something that red hair can't do. You're leaving me alone? She failed to keep the dread out of her voice. Kite will be here. He's a good alarm. I don't get visitors. That's part of why I live the way I do. Unless some crazy woman decides to take a leisurely hike in a snowstorm, he added with a little smile. She set the spoon down and sighed. Very well. If you think that this is the best solution, we'll do it. His mouth moved as if he was about to say something, but he changed his mind. Instead, he gave a firm nod. They ate in silence. Long after she'd climbed into the narrow cot and he stretched out in front of the fire, her mind was in turmoil. How was it that she could grow so fond of a man she knew nothing about? And, if he did manage to negotiate her safe passage, could she live her life knowing that she'd never know how he'd fared up here in the mountains of Montana? Breakfast? He eyed the plate she held out dubiously. You said that the meal last night was fine? She retorted and pressed the plate closer to him until he took it. He chuckled at her and sat down on the small chair. It was still dark, and he'd risen to tack up the horse. She'd been attuned to every move he made. She'd stoked the fire and felt the need to do something, anything, to occupy her meandering mind. He tucked into the fare with a sound of appreciation on the first mouthful. There's firewood at the door. Always keep Kite with you. He's a good alarm if there's something, or someone, nearby. She wrapped her fingers around the cup she held as she sat on the cot. She didn't say anything, her eyes moving to the frosted window. She'd lain awake most of the night after her long sleep out of Wolfburg. In the dying embers of the fire, she'd rolled over to find him watching her in the glow. The look had been brief. She'd had to close her eyes against the burn of unshed tears. When she'd looked again, he was asleep once more. The rifle at the door is loaded. Do you know how to use it? Her eyes moved to the gleaming black barrel against the door. She shook her head. He set the empty plate away from him and stood, crossing the room. He collected up the gun. Come here, I'll show you. This is a yellow boy. See? Breech loading. He clicked a lever, and the barrel opened halfway along. Ebba tried to follow his explanations, though it felt heavy and alien to her when she held it. That's the dangerous end, he said as she moved it about. He took it from her and stowed it back against the frame. You probably won't have need for it, but it can be enough to scare people away. Fire it into the air if you get any wild animals nearby. A carcass will attract all sorts in next to no time. I made up a pack for you, she said. She collected up the wrapped parcel and offered it to him. A strange look moved over his face. Instead, he held her green gaze, roaming her face as though trying to commit it to memory. You didn't have to. The same as you didn't have to save me again yesterday. I would have waltzed into the train station none the wiser if you hadn't been alerted to those dangers. You spend enough time amongst the undesirables like me, you develop certain skills. She tilted her head, wondering how he could label himself as undesirable. Thank you, Hal, for everything you're doing. His hand came up, fingering the feathery edge of the plait that hung over her shoulder before they came up to stroke her cheek. In that moment, she held her breath as his lips tenderly brushed her forehead. When she released her breath, he stood at the open door, the small food pack in hand, and was looking back at her. Don't go beyond the clearing. I'll be back before nightfall. Kite scratched the door. The sudden sound dragged her attention back inside the cabin. Ebba sighed as Kite sent her a look of judgment with those large brown eyes before his nose was pressed back against the doorframe. He sniffed profusely. Ebba levered herself away from where she'd been leaning against the window, avidly watching the trees surrounding the cabin and awaiting Hal's return. You're right, she said out loud to the dog. A watched pot never boils. The dog danced on the spot, waiting for her to open the door. He trotted merrily out into the yard, his paws sinking into the soft, powdery snow. The frigid air curled itself around her, and she quickly disappeared back inside the cabin, back into the warm. Her body didn't seem to be able to hold on to its heat since she'd left Fry's place. She held her hands out to the swaying flames in the hearth. She'd swept the floor and washed up the breakfast things. She'd brought in firewood to dry off. She'd made the bed and tidied up. mundane activities to occupy the hours that crawled by. She wished now that she had Hal's ability to be able to tell the time from the position of the sun, although the low cloud coverage would surely make that impossible right now. She tried telling herself that the delay was nothing to worry about. He'd not had the chance to trade anything since she'd arrived. The food provisions were low, so maybe that was causing a delay. Maybe he was having difficulty finding someone who was willing to go up against a man such as Bruce Frey. She added wood to the fire, stoked it so that it roared in the fireplace. Kite's joyful yips brought her to her feet. Relief rushed through her. She dusted off her hands and flew out of the door in her eagerness to see him. Chapter 10. Hal brushed at the powdery snow that showered from the branch he rode past. A glance at the bruised sky told him that the hour was edging towards early evening. He hadn't intended to stay away this long, but negotiations had taken a while. He'd been right in what he'd said to Ebba. Traders were a suspicious lot, and they wanted details, as well as to see what it was going to cost him. And cost him it had. Some of his best furs were happily snapped up. Trappers were ruthless when they could smell desperation. He couldn't wait to tell her that he'd arranged a total of 3 people to escort her through the mountains. She might not be home for Christmas like she wanted, but she'd be safe and away from Frey. He could shrug the cost off. After all, she was paying him for the privilege, but the truth of it was that the trade was more poignant than he'd admit out loud. She'd made him breakfast and packed what little rations remained so that he'd have food out on the trail. It had been too many years to count since someone else had put his needs before theirs. She'd not slept much last night. He'd been aware of every soft sigh and turn she made. He'd watched her in the glow of the fire, drinking in the views of having her to look at, knowing that the opportunity to gaze at her was fading fast. When he'd been in the general store stocking up, he'd added a book to the pile of items, just so that she'd have something to read on her travels. Perhaps something to remember him by. Through the trees, he spotted the apex roof of the cabin against the darkening sky. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a small smile touched his mouth. Too many years to count since he'd looked forward to climbing down off his horse and having pleasant company for the evening meal. It was bittersweet that it would be their last night together. He'd bought the book to see if he could make her smile again. It was Kite that sent ripples of alarm rolling through him. He was barking, only it wasn't coming from the cabin. The horse stepped through the trees and out into the open, and Hal's stomach dropped. "Ebba?" he called out, sliding off his mount and unclipping his rifle in one motion. "Ebba, it's me." His assessing gaze ran over the darkened cabin. The snow in the yard was ruffled. Horses, men, someone had been here. Hal burst through the front door, but the cabin was empty. The bearskin rug was in place, but he checked the crawl space where he'd secluded her last time. "Ebba," he yelled, marching back outside. Kite's yipping has moved to loud barking and was coming from the outhouse. He let the dog out. His flare of hope that she'd somehow locked herself in there petered out as the dog wrapped himself through his legs. "Kite, where is she?" He marched back into the cabin. He let loose a string of curses when he saw the rifle leaning against the door jamb where he'd set it. For just a moment, he wondered if she'd left of her own accord. She'd grown sick of waiting for him. She was desperate to get back home for Christmas. Maybe she'd... Then he saw the makeshift linen pack at the foot of the bed. Heart in his throat, he tugged the edges, and the familiar objects tumbled free across the mattress. Mirror, brush, trinkets. His breath left his body and fury blasted through him. He snatched up the rifle and slammed the door behind him on his way out. The piano and the banjo slapped out a jaunty tune. Some people clapped along to the beat. A few stepped and jigged along, laughing gaily. Boughs of greenery adorned the ceiling, peppered with dried berries and sprigs of apples. Candles danced along with the music, their collective light lost in the warm glow from the wall lamps. The drapes were drawn against the nightfall. A fat fir tree occupied the corner of the grand saloon, proudly decked in popcorn strings and berry swathes. Friends and neighbors celebrated with abandon, delving into the fine feast that had been laid out for them. Their faces were pink from the heat roaring out of the huge fireplace. Shouts of laughter and raucous calls battered Ebba's senses. She longed for peace, for stillness, for cool air. "Smile!" Bruce growled into her ear. She would have leaned away from his fetid breath that was laced with whiskey, but his heavy arm around her shoulders had effectively pinned her to his side. "We're celebrating our marriage." Ebba had attended festive parties across the years. She was usually the first on her feet and adored being swept around the floor by a handsome admirer. But this wasn't a celebration. This was a kidnapping. "I don't feel well," she muttered. "You need to eat, girl." His lips stretched wide, but his teeth remained clamped tight. "I'm not hungry." Nausea rolled through her, and she had to blink against the tears. He nuzzled her neck and growled out, "You chose to come here. You're the one who wanted this life." She bit the inside of her cheek to stave off the tears that burned the backs of her eyes. "I did not choose this. There wasn't a choice." He laughed then, loudly, as if she'd told the funniest joke. Effective, she thought, when his guests turned to watch them. To them, they must look like the happiest of couples who couldn't bear to be apart. Everything he did was for effect. But underneath the veneer of joviality, he was a beast. He took hold of her jaw and gripped painfully. Maniacal light shone brightly in his bloodshot eyes. "You speak as though you're hard done by, my dear." His grasp of her tightened. "There is always a choice. Between you shooting that poor dog and burning down a man's home, or me coming with you." The grip loosened. "Exactly. You would have done those things, and then still I would have had to come with you," she hissed, fury burning inside. "I will run again." "No, you won't. I will marry you. Then your funds will become mine, and you will be worthless until you provide me an heir." She shook her head, but any words were cut off as he kissed her. Cheers erupted around the room. Impotent tears tracked down her cheeks. She should have checked the window. She should have picked up Hal's rifle. She should have leapt off the horse that she'd been hauled onto to bring her back here. She should have. It had become a mantra ever since Bruce had carried her back into home. He'd laughed at her as she yelled her protests. The impromptu party had been hastily thrown together in her honor, and Bruce had announced to their delighted guests that he would be marrying his sweetheart tomorrow. Christmas Eve. She'd refused to cooperate, but he hadn't laid a finger on her. She'd goaded him this time, daring him to strike her to delay the wedding once again. All she needed was a window of opportunity to escape. He'd learned from last time. She'd been watched like a hawk and had been assigned a guard for the duration. She'd not even be allowed to take a natural break alone. Bruce Frey was taking no chances with his bride this time. "Save it for the wedding night." A man clapped Bruce on the shoulder, the amber-colored liquid swinging crazily in his glass. "Mayor Carter, sir. I'm so glad you could make it." Bruce let go of her face to pump the hand of the other man. "Couldn't miss such a grand gathering, could I?" "Bruce?" "Hello, my dear." The mayor turned his attention to her. He had kind brown eyes, and his mustache flickered as he smiled. "I trust you're feeling better now?" Ebba took the hand he proffered out of habit. She is, thank you, John," Bruce interrupted her. "Well, that's great news. Sad that you had to delay the wedding, but probably best considering the storm that blasted through here. Bruce tells me you hail from the east?" "Boston," Bruce nodded. "Is Mary with you this evening?" The mayor flicked an irritated look at Bruce when he'd answered for her yet again. "Yes, she is." He leaned forward toward Ebba, as though divulging a secret. "My wife is looking forward to the celebrations tomorrow. She loves a wedding, although I think it's just an excuse for her to order a new dress." Ebba smiled, because it was expected of her. She wisely kept her mouth shut, lest Bruce could interrupt her once more. The mayor's heavy brows twitched in consternation. "You should meet her." John Carter looked about the room. "She's here somewhere." His hand stilled just as the music ended. A blissful hush descended over the splendid room. The mayor's hand had dropped, but Ebba was already looking in the direction where he'd paused mid-sweep. There was a shuffling of feet when people shrank away from the fury radiating off the uninvited guest who loomed in the archway. Chapter 11. "Can I help you?" Bruce called out cheerily. Several of his staff appeared in the alcove. One had a bloody nose and the other's eye was already swelling. They swarmed behind Hal but remained out of his reach. "We tried to stop him, boss." "That's okay, Ricky." Bruce waved away the apology, though Ebba could detect the steely undertone. "It's a party. You must be the mountain man I've been hearing so much about. You're a looker, ain't ya? Bet you're fighting the girls off with that ugly mug." He guffawed at his own joke, but the room remained quiet. "Take your hands off her," Hal said quietly, his tone low and lethal. "I won't ask again." Bruce swept his hand wide. "Come on in and join us. We're celebrating our marriage." Hal's impassive gaze was yet to leave Ebba's stricken face. "It's done?" Bruce's laughter boomed out, encouraging a smattering of nervous tittering in amongst the crowd. "Not yet. The pastor here will wed us in the morning. My guests are here for a Christmas gathering. Won't you have a drink?" Ebba leaned toward Hal, but Bruce's arm clamped tighter around her. Her breath hissed out. "Bruce, do you know this man?" John Carter asked. "I'm afraid I don't, no." "Then how do you?" Bruce grinned reptilian-like when the question trailed off. "Slight misunderstanding between my fiancée and me. This man was kind enough to step into the breach when I needed some help." Hal's jaw flexed. "Ebba, are you okay?" She shook her head. "Is Kite okay?" Hal's good brow lowered. "He's fine. Why was he in the barn?" "Because it was for his own good," Bruce snapped. "Bud, can you take over here? I'm going to show my new friend into the study." Bud moved, but Hal planted his feet and folded his arms. "We'll talk out here where there are plenty of witnesses, if it's all the same to you." "Fry." Bruce chuckled. "My good man, I don't know." "I've seen what you can do to a defenseless woman when there's no witnesses," Hal ground out. A cluster of gasps rippled through the crowd. "So, anything you have to say to me, you can say it here, in the open." Bud's hand slid over Hal's shoulder. "Let's go, mountain man." Hal shook him off easily. "I'm not going anywhere without her." "I'm not sure who you are." The mayor stepped into the breach between Bruce and Hal, patting the air as if trying to soothe the anger that vibrated there. "But you're in a man's home. The sheriff is a good friend of mine. We don't want any trouble here. So why don't you do as Bruce asks? Whatever the issue is with you and Miss Ebba, it can be dealt with in private." "Great." Hal clapped his hands and rubbed them together. "Fetch the sheriff. You can explain to him why a young woman is being held here against her will." Hal's mouth flattened, his eyes glittering with rage. He slanted a look at the stunned mayor. "Go ahead, I've got all night." "You've burst into my home," Bruce flung at him, laying all kinds of accusations against my good name. He released Ebba to advance on Hal, his fists balled at his sides. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Ebba dove in between both men, her arms wide. "Bruce, wait." But her words were cast aside just as she was. Bruce only stopped when her pained cry was accompanied by the shocked cries of his dinner guests. His eyes roved around the room before settling on Ebba. She took Hal's outstretched hand, and he helped her up. He linked his fingers through hers. "This is the second time today you've protected a filthy dog from me," Bruce snarled at her. "Did you know that?" His eyes moved to Hal. "Simprosity. This fool girl stepped in front of my rifle to save your mangy mutt." Bolstered by the contact from Hal, her chin lifted. "And I'd do it again and again." "Oh, I see what's going on here," Bruce sniggered nastily. "He forced himself on you and now you think you're in love with him. Why else would you want to save his home and his ragged mongrel?" "It's okay, Ebba. I'm not a virgin either. But you stay here with me." "No," she said. "You're leaving with that?" Bruce gesticulated. "Look at his face." "Your comments mean nothing to me, Bruce," she said. "He has more kindness in his little finger than you ever would have if you added up a lifetime of it." "Ebba?" Hal tugged at her hand, and she stepped back. "Where are you going, Ebba?" Bruce matched her step when Hal began to retreat. "You're my fiancée." She shook her head. "I don't want to marry you, Bruce. I didn't the other day. Why else would I jump out of a window to escape you?" "You escaped?" the mayor asked her, his voice booming over the murmuring crowd. "Yes, sir," she said. "Mr. Frey paid someone to write to me. I was brought here under false pretenses. When I told him I was going back to my parents in Boston, Her voice was squeezed painfully as memories swam in her mind's eye. "That's why there was a delay. He'd hurt me. I left." "It's okay," Mayor Carter said soothingly. "Mary, can you help Miss?" Frampton, Ebba supplied to him. Miss Frampton, I'd like to speak with. You're choosing to leave my home for a murderer, Bruce boomed, ridiculing them with a laugh. You idiot, he killed his wife and child. Look at where he lives. The growl emitted from Hal's throat, and he'd knocked Frey to the ground before either Bud or Ricky could react. He raised his hand to strike him again when Bud caught the punch. He's not worth it. Ebba heard the quiet warning as she wrapped her hand around his bicep and squeezed. He's right, she said softly. Come on. Fierce light banked in his gray eyes when he looked at her. She smiled, nodded at him, and he lowered his arm. Bruce scrambled to his feet. You foolish girl, can't you see he only wants you for your money? Ebba had had enough. The mirthless bark slipped out. No, he doesn't, because he doesn't know that my family has money. Not everyone cares about such things, Bruce. Frampton, the mayor said, stepping into the quarrel with his arms spread, though he was looking at Ebba with renewed interest. You said your name was Frampton? Any relation to George Frampton? Ebba's flow halted, and she swung a questioning gaze at him. He's my father, yes. I know him. The mayor's smile grew over her answer. Yes, the shipping family. My father did business with, well, I suppose he was your grandfather. The mayor stepped a little closer, snapped his fingers. Samuel, yes, I remember. Mary, can you believe that this is little Ebba? The woman who'd been next to him took the opportunity to intervene, ushering them both from the room. Goodness, no. You must have been very young when I saw you last. How is your mother? Ebba allowed herself to be pushed past Frey's men, past the threshold of his home and out into the frigid winter's night before she said anything. I'm afraid I don't recall meeting you, Mrs. Carter. Mary looked back to check the door was closed. I've never been to Boston in my life, my dear. But John will explain his claims, I'm sure. I'm sorry that you had to deal with that, Mrs. Carter, Hal said to the mayor's wife as he dropped his coat onto a shivering Ebba. I'm afraid I was furious, so I apologize for my behavior. Mary sked at him and clicked her fingers at the driver who'd walked toward her. Frey's parties have always been a contest to see which of them had the bigger wallet. Boring. It was actually a relief to have him outed in public so that people can see him for the dreadful man he is. Her carriage rolled closer, and she opened the door. After tonight, his life will be different. You can't keep an event like this under wraps, no matter how much money you throw at it. Frey doesn't have money, Ebba stated. She'd worked it out earlier that evening when he'd been cutting corners with the food that was being prepared. That's what he needed me for. Well, my dowry. My grandfather made me a wealthy woman. Mary nodded in understanding. I see, but you're safe now. The footman set down the box to help her inside. Behind them, the front door opened, and Mary Carter was illuminated in the rectangle of light. Her husband joined them in the yard. Are you well, my dear? He asked Mary. She nodded and allowed him to help her up. He put a foot onto the board and looked at Hal. Frey has been threatened with the full extent of the law. I will call by the sheriff's house to appraise him of the events. He has been warned that there are to be no repercussions. If anything happens to either of you, we will be looking at him, his men, and his businesses closely, but... His voice trailed off and his eyes moved to Ebba. I hope you'll forgive my little ruse. Do you know my father? I do, yes. We've done business, but it was a long time ago. He shipped over land then, he added with a smile. We've remained in contact, plus we get newspapers out here. I can keep up with events and financials. He's done incredibly well for himself, though I never would sit at a card table with him again, he said quietly with a wink. I hope that you get all that you need from this, my dear. He smiled at her and held his hand out to Hal. You'll see that she's looked after, Miss... Hal Wyman. Hal shook the older man's hand. Yes, sir, and thank you for what you did. It was nice to meet you. You should call by some time. I'm not sure the mayor has a need for a trapper. Mayor Carter leaned in. Traders are always useful people to know. They stepped back, and the mayor climbed in and shut the door. The carriage rolled off, and Hal wasted no time in taking hold of her hand. He pulled her toward the tree line where he'd tethered his horse. She stumbled along behind him, thoughts dragging at the frozen inertia that had gripped her. Wait, she pulled her hand away from him. Where are we going? Hal stopped and faced her. Away from here, for a start. Back to the cabin until daylight. I can't. What do you mean, you can't? I have traders on standby to take you home. Ebba released a soft sigh. In the moonlight, shadows lent a menace to his face, but she'd only known tenderness from him. He'd helped her time and again. She searched that face that had come to mean so much. Being this close to him brought her a sense of joyful peace. And yet, what is it? Ebba closed her eyes, pushing the question past the constriction in her throat. Did you kill your wife? Chapter 12. The soft hiss of the lamp grew as light filled the interior of the cabin. Hal busied himself lighting more lamps, moving silently about the small room. Ebba hovered at the sides, unsure how to react to the sullen man that remedied the chill of the room by lighting the fire. Even Kite lay at the door, his brown eyes tracking Hal. It had made sense coming to the cabin, if only to get away from Frey and his men. The workers had lingered in the yard, unsure of their duties as the guests were filing out of the house. The mayor may have threatened Frey with consequences should he take the law into his own hands, but that wouldn't be much help if Bruce decided to come after them with a gun. Finally, Hal sat on the chair, arms on his thighs as he stared into the fire. Ebba lowered herself onto the cot. Tension crackled in the air. She waited despite the urge to offer him comfort and to settle the anguish that she could see etched into his face. I didn't kill her. There was a deep note to his voice, a place of remembered pain and suffering. Finally, gradually, he raised his angst-filled eyes to meet hers. But I am responsible for their deaths. Ebba swallowed the involuntarily gasp that bubbled in her. She watched him, unsure how she could comfort him when he seemed so tortured. We lived in a small town in Oregon, he said, his eyes moving back to the fire, though. She could tell that he wasn't seeing the same hearth she was. Joseph was just a baby. I wanted to provide for him. I was given a promotion in the factory where I worked. It was more money. The job came with a small house. It was in a row of homes that the managers and their families lived in. It had a small garden. Lucy could plant her vegetables. Joseph would have space to play. We got him a dog. Ebba's gaze moved to where Kite sat against the door. Kite sounded like a child's name for his pet. Hal continued. I was moving up the board and I knew that I was going to do well in the job role. The owner of the factory was a good man. He threw ostentatious parties regularly. He would invite his managers and their families to his home. We'd been once the year before. Lucy and we'd never seen the likes of such a grand occasion. I swear I could hear the table groaning under the weight of the roasted meats. He smiled at the memory, rubbing his interlaced fingers together. Lucy hadn't been well, so she'd decided to stay home the night of the party. She sent me to the drugstore to get some medicine. I kissed her good night. He cleared his throat, rubbed his chin, and exhaled loudly. The dinner party was going well, and we heard the clanging bells first, and when we all stepped out onto the street, I could see the blaze over the rooftop. This time she couldn't contain the soft gasp. I don't remember much after that. The men all organized to lend a hand with buckets, but when I realized that it was the row of houses where I lived, I tried to get in there. I tried to save them, he said. His scars, they were burns. Her cheeks were wet as her grief took over his. He shook his head. It was my fault. Ebba was on her knees by his feet without consciously moving. How, Hal? How is a terrible fire your fault? I bought her the medicine. The neighbors had knocked and knocked, but she must have slept on. They told me that Kite's constant barking had alerted them that something was wrong. They kicked down the door, but the flames. I tried to get in, he said again. Stop. I should have been there. Hal, I could have saved them. She covered his hands with hers, framed his face with her hands. Or you could have died, Hal. And then who would have saved me in that storm? God has a plan for us all. I'm so sorry about Lucy, about your little boy. I truly am. But your wife wouldn't have wanted you to carry the burden. She would have been proud of you getting your promotion, of knowing that you were doing your best by them. Tears shone in the gaze that held hers. A smile ghosted across his lips. That sounds like something she would have said. Then she was a smart woman, too. Ebba was pushed back as Kite's nose pressed between them. He leaned against Hal's leg, tongue lolling. which pulled a soft, dry laugh from him. He ruffled the dog's coat. "That's why I must look after him. He saved all those people. He tried to save Lucy and Joseph." "He's a good dog." Ebba ran a hand over the dog's head and his eyes rolled back in ecstasy. "Did you really step in front of a loaded rifle to save him?" She nodded and avoided the sharp look Hal was giving her. "I knew how much he meant to you. I hadn't bothered checking the window, didn't pick up the rifle. Kite was in front of me, growling and snarling. They pulled the gun on me, said they'd burn your place down too if I didn't go with them. I'd already caused you enough problems. I couldn't let you lose everything." He took her hands in his. "I thought I'd lost you. I was demented when those men barricaded the door to prevent me from going into his house." "I would have escaped again," she quipped. "How did you know where I was?" "Not hard to fathom that it was Frey's lot who'd been here, but I knew you'd not run away because your trinkets were sat on the bed where they'd been this morning. Some things are too valuable to leave behind." His eyes moved between hers, down to her mouth. He gently touched where the bruises were already forming along her jaw from Frey's manhandling. "I should have hit him again for putting more marks on you. He's humiliated enough after tonight. He can't last much longer. I'm certain that he's broke. I was his last-ditch attempt at digging himself out of the hole he was in." His forehead touched hers, and her hands moved to his shoulders. "You should still leave town. You can take the first train out of here. There's no telling what might happen if you delay leaving." Her hands dropped as she leaned back. Regret pumped through her. He was right. She had to leave. Her parents would be frantic about her welfare. She'd not had chance to let them know she'd arrived, nor what had transpired since. She wiped at the tears that tracked down her cheeks. He swiped at them, gently cupping her face. "What's wrong?" "I came here for adventure. I don't want the city men that my father paraded through the salon with their sycophantic mannerisms and dull tales. I want mountain air. I want peace." "You can't have that here, Ebba. Not with Bruce Frey about. He'll be filled with bloodlust by the morning when word spreads." "I want you, Hal Wyman." His mouth slowly curved up and his thumb plucked her lower lip. "You want to live in the wilds with a man like me? Won't your folks lose their minds?" "They won't when they meet you." Something akin to panic shimmered in his eyes. "I can't. I—" She laid a finger across the words that he tripped over. "They'll love you almost as much as I do when they get to know you." He stilled as he stared at her, as though he wasn't quite sure that he believed her. "You love me." She nodded at the statement. "I do, and I'm hoping that I haven't got it wrong and that you care for me too." "I do. I have ever since I got a look at your gorgeous green eyes, but I—" His face creased with despair. "I can't live in a city again, Ebba." And Polly. "There's more than one mountain in Montana. I have money, Hal. We can buy land if we like. Build a bigger cabin, one with actual rooms, bed chambers. Though it must have a hatch in the floor," she whispered playfully as she placed a hand on his chest. "Do you know what you'll be giving up living here, not in the city? You might change your mind in a few years, want to hightail it back to civilization, and—" She stared at him, spread her hands in vexation. "I'll go where you go, mountain man, and that's a promise. How about we try and get you back home? At least so your parents can see that you're safe, and I can ask your father for his permission to marry his daughter?" Her hands went around his neck and threaded through the hair at his nape. She raised her eyes to his face and delighted in the idea that soon she would be free to hold him whenever she liked. "I think that sounds like a plan." His eyes fell to her mouth as his hands cupped the back of her head, and he finally claimed her mouth with his own. Epilogue. The scent of ginger permeated the air of the lodge. Ebba slid the cookies off the baking tray and wiped her hands on her apron. "No." She slapped the hand away as Hal made a grab for one. "Why not?" He rubbed his hand playfully. "And that hurt." Ebba tilted her head and lifted a brow. "Really?" His grin was unrepentant, but he settled up to her and glided his arms around her waist, laughing against her throat. "No, not really. Have I told you lately how pretty you are?" Ebba sighed and turned into the embrace. "Flattery, Wyman, will get you everywhere. Now, please move. I have so much to do." Hal danced back and snatched a handful of biscuits up. He snapped one in half, dropped the other to the waiting dog. He placed one on the tray of the chair where his daughter banged her spoon against it. "Here you go, beautiful. You're going to spoil her supper. It's one cookie. Don't you have something to do? Bud should be back soon." She wagged a finger at him. "He's coming up the driveway now." Hal winked and left via the back door. Ebba gasped and hurried to the window. Sure enough, she could see a wagon making its way slowly up the drive. She let out a delighted cry, which drew her daughter's attention. "Come, Callie." She lifted her daughter out of the chair. "You're going to meet your grandparents." She stepped out onto the veranda and had to narrow her eyes against the brightest of the winter sun bouncing off the snowy vista. Hal ambled across the yard and unlocked the gate, swinging it wide as Bud steered the wagon through. She watched as her husband greeted her parents. It always warmed her to see how well they treated the man who'd saved their daughter in more ways than one. She'd escaped Christmas 2 years ago and had married Hal in Boston when she'd persuaded him to accompany her back to meet her parents. They'd been bowled over by the quiet mountain man who clearly adored their little girl. They'd built the lodge not far from where Hal's original hut was. Still to this day, she didn't know the cause of Bruce Frey's demise, but when they'd returned as husband and wife from Boston, Frey was no longer a cause for concern, and so they'd stayed and built a life for themselves here in the mountains. Daphne Frampton clapped her hands over her ruddy cheeks when she saw the little red-haired girl in Ebba's arms. With a little cry, she rushed forward and scooped up her grandchild, raining kisses down on the child's crown. Ebba accepted the distracted hug from her mother and delighted as she watched her mother fuss over Callie as though she'd been doing it all along. She ferried the quick-fire questions her mother threw at her about their home. It was their first time seeing the property and where she'd built her life. She was about to head inside when Bud pointed out the second wagon making its way up the drive. Christmas this year was set to be a busy one, with family and local friends due. It was the first one in their lodge. She waited to greet Mayor Carter and Mary, swiftly followed by the sheriff and his wife. Bud had proven to be a good addition to the workforce. He was a quiet man who'd shown up to offer his congratulations in the early days. His local knowledge meant that he and Hal had struck up a good conversation. So when they'd bought the parcel of land and began to build the business, Bud seemed like a natural choice to take on. He was well respected in the area and was good at following rules. He'd declined his invite to Christmas meal, instead joining a few of the other ranch hands in the newly built bunkhouse. "How's business?" she heard her father ask her husband as she ushered her guests through the door. She turned and she held up her hand. "No business talks. It's Christmas," she scolded them. They would spend all day chatting about the fledgling business that Hal had started if she gave them the chance. Each time the two men were together, they would swap stories. "It's good," Hal said as an aside to his father-in-law. "Lumber production is slower at this time of year, but we're doing okay." Ebba fisted her hands on her hips to glare at them both. "I mean it, both of you. You can talk shop tomorrow." "That's her mama tone," Hal murmured to her father and slid an arm around her to nuzzle her temple. "Okay, sweetheart, we'll do Christmas today, and we'll do it your way." "Good." She smiled, kissed her husband, and then disappeared in through the door. George Frampton chuckled and clapped Hal on the shoulder. "You've absolutely got a handle on that girl, son. I admire you for it. I never thought I'd see the day." Hal looked through the kitchen window to where his wife and daughter were. He could see the fine, festive greenery that he'd put up to decorate his home and make his new friends feel welcome. To beyond the lodge that he'd made into a home, to the woods and the land that nourished them all. "Oh no, George," Hal shook his head. He held the door open for his father-in-law. "She's the one who's given me everything I could ever ask for when I didn't know that I was looking. I think that God dropped her on me to bring me back. She tells the story like I saved her, but she's the one who saved me. I'd wager that she's the one who's got a handle on me." George's face warmed with contentment, and he nodded. "You're a wise man, Hal. Let's get a drink and get Christmas as a family started, shall we?" The end.